we're here to talk about something that I think has become more and more part of the consciousness that we have and where our country is and what it's about. This morning as I was driving out from home, I was driving behind a car, and what did I see on the bumper sticker of the car but a Ron Paul bumper sticker from 2012, and the slogan that was on the bumper sticker was, "Restore America Now." And I myself am associated with a website that we started some years back. It's called Renew America. I remember talking at an organization some years back that had been going for quite a while, and it's a whole moniker, and it had conferences and speakers and so forth, and it was called Reclaim America. Renew America, Restore America, Reclaim America, Take Back America. The only thing you can be sure of, you hear such slogans, is that America is not what it used to be. And we want to see if we can get it back to what it needs to be again. There's no doubt, I think, that as I travel the country, as I hear from folks, I find myself more and more impressed with the fact that Americans are filled with a sense that this nation is in decline, and more than decline, that it stands at the border edge of a precipitous collapse. Maybe that's partly, I was thinking about this earlier today, the result of the fact that the experience we had on September 11, 2001, I think it started to prepare us for the shocking truth. I can remember that morning, as I'm sure everybody does, and there I was standing in front of the television. Now, it's a couple of hours after my wife had first called me to tell me, well, I've seen what happened. And I think we were all watching, listening to the accounts, and that image of the towers with the plumes of smoke coming out of them constantly. And then, out of nowhere, suddenly, unexpectedly, in a way that I shall never forget, because you literally lived through a moment in which the bottom fell out of your guts and you were just left helpless when that building, in the course of what seemed like seconds, just collapsed into the ground. I have not had an experience that so epitomizes the sense of shock and awe, as they say, as that moment. And it reminds you that things that look so solid that we human beings put up that seem so awesome in a moment, they are, like the grass, gone, withered, undone. And that was 9/11. I think that sense, that suddenly, awfully, what we think to be so grand can just collapse away, now haunts us as a people, now haunts us as a nation, as we see and feel the signs, the things that we have counted on, understandings that help to build our strength, are being undone, and that we ourselves shall not just wither, but suddenly fall away. And I think that's the sense that leads us to be casting about, with the sense that we've got to reclaim, we've got to renew, we've got to rebuild what was the solid foundation that perhaps can keep us from that fate. And I know that the slogan that Jack makes use of, which I think is so appropriate and has been for a long time, because he had that sense long before others were acting on it. That sense that we have to take our country back. And I'm sure that the first thing folks think of when they hear a phrase like that, we have to take it back, is that we're taking it back from somebody. But today I want to talk about it in the other sense, the sense that I think is more profound perhaps because it is also the true and positive sense, in which I think our spirit is really moved to take it. And that's the fact that we want to take America back to when it was what it was and is supposed to be. But in order to do that, I deeply believe that we have to take it back to this place where those foundations were laid. We have to refamiliarize ourselves with exactly what was the strong foundation that allowed the edifice of our nation's success to rise, that allowed our founders to found the nation that was based, in fact, on the premise later articulated by Abraham Lincoln, a premise rejected by every thinker and every philosopher in the history of the world. The premise of government of, by, and for the people. The premise of a government and a nation that would consign its fate not to the wealthy and not to the powerful and not to the conquerors and not to the wizards of this and that kind of knowledge, but yet to the ordinary and regular and everyday people who composed that nation's life. All of them scoffed at that thought, thought it was impossible, and all down through the ages it was ridiculed and laughed at. And yet the founders of the United States decided that they would embark upon an experiment on behalf, they said, of all mankind to show that yes, indeed, the people could take its fate into its hands and shape a nation that would be decent and just, and in which people could find peace and opportunity. Well, the nation they founded not only found those elements of decent and ordinary human ambition. We can look back on a record that unhappily, I guess we have to feel at the moment, recently came perhaps to its peak. In a moment when we were acknowledged to be not just the greatest nation in the world, but most likely the greatest nation in the history. All from what? All from the willingness of a privileged few, because that's what many of the founders were, to entrust the future of a nation that was at that moment in their hands. Not to themselves, as every other country in the world pretty much at their time was doing, but rather to the common sense, common heart, common decency of the people of the United States. And so they did. But in trying to remember what they did, we have to ask ourselves what might have been the real reason for it. Why did they take what must have seemed, and they were educated men, to be a tremendous risk? And they knew it, by the way. You can't read their letters, you can't read the Federalist Papers or any of the other expositions of the challenge they saw in what they had to do, both as they were opposing Great Britain and preparing the revolution, as they fought it, as they then sat down later to frame the Constitution. They didn't do so with the sense that we carelessly have now of great faith in what we call democracy. What does democracy mean? It means the strength of the people. Well, they didn't express much faith in that. They didn't have much faith in it. Because they looked back at the history of the world and they said, whoa, wait a minute, just about everywhere democracy's been tried, it's ended up being a disaster. Is there any way that we can avoid that disaster? Guess where they found their answer? Well, we don't have to guess. Because unlike some nations, our origins and the thinking that went into those origins, our origins are not hidden behind some misty fog of ever-darkening years in the past. No, we can look at the documents, we can read the letters, we can understand the arguments that were being made. And what did they say? They actually gave an exposition of the essence of their thinking. In a document that has not only run down through the history of our country, it has run throughout the world to inspire others to strive for a government that would be based on the same premises and the same principles. And in a phrase, or a paragraph, that actually is still, I think, familiar to most Americans. They, of course, don't teach it quite as assiduously in the schools as they want to do. They captured the essence of the bedrock foundation of humanity. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That was it. Simple premise, on the basis of which they thought it would be possible to do what had really never successfully been done before in the history of mankind. Erect a great and successful nation on the strength of the goodwill of the people themselves. Well, is that what they did? Well, it is, but they carefully laid out in that simple expression of sentiment what was the real substance of that goodwill that made that possibility possible. What was it? Well, we see it in the words themselves. All men are created equal. and endowed by their Creator. The bedrock premise of American life. That the endowment, the substance on which we must rely as we erect the edifice of our nation's life is not the whim of the majority, is not the will of the powerful. It is rather our acknowledgement of and respect for the will of our Almighty God, who set the universe in motion and put the stars in place, and who, if a nation is to be erected that reflects the good will of the people, must first be founded upon the good will of Almighty God. And that's what they did. But sometimes these days, that truth becomes more and more obscure to us. You know why? Because we have accepted a generation of leadership that has essentially turned their back on the Declaration. They no longer are willing to quote it, to acknowledge it, at least in part because they have allowed themselves to be intimidated and shamed by claims, usually made, by the way, not by scientists themselves, but by others, but they occasionally do, as I'll talk about. They allow themselves to be intimidated by the claim that, well, there really is no God. We really don't need God. And in fact, that translated into the notion that we can not only do without God, but we must do without Him because of a doctrine that they call the separation of church and state. So we've got to keep God out of our political affairs. I have never fathomed, never understood how the people of the United States can at one and the same time keep going to the polls, exercising self-government, exercising their part as members of the sovereign body of the people, choosing the ministers, even the highest office, the president, choosing the legislators, the folks who make the laws, choosing the judges, exercising the power that was, until this nation made it otherwise, exercised by kings and queens and potentates and tyrants. It is exercised instead by the people of the United States assembling on election days to go into that voting booth, and each of us adds our share to that which forms the will of the American people. How can we see all that going on, trace it back to the fundamental declaration of truth that verified and established the claim of the people to have such a position in the life of their country, and then read the words that make it clear what it's based upon. The created, equal, and endowed by our Creator. And then listen to people tell us that we must separate God, the Creator, from our country and think we're going to survive. Why do we do? Are we mad that we think we'll be able to take away the very foundation of the nation's life and it will stand? This doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. The nation will not stand, and it is not standing. Which is why every day since we began to accept the lie that we can turn our back on God and still continue to be the American people, we have found ourselves estranged from our own identity, estranged from our own heart, estranged from our own courage and our own faith, and the realization of that potential that we can still feel within us, because it is not the potential of this or that nation. It is the potential endowed by God in the nature of every human being. And all we have done in America is, by respecting His will, help to release the power of that potential for our good. And that means, of course, that we have a challenge before us to try to understand the meaning of what was said in that declaration, so that we can begin to reclaim the strength that our reliance upon its truth is possible. But as I say, a lot of folks in our politics, these days, most of them in fact, they don't want to go back to the Declaration. I suppose they're intimidated because these days, what is considered to be more archaic and more unacceptable than to tell people that we have to go back. The past is now condemned as if everything about it was something awful. We are an ungrateful generation. We no longer are willing to acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of the giants that came before us. Instead, we despise them as pygmies and think that we alone have erected the heights to which we climb. It, of course, makes no sense, but it means that if you tell folks, well, we should take the wisdom of the founders seriously, we should go back and try to understand how they thought and what they did, you're just going to be laughed at in court. They're going to say, well, why would we listen to those people? They owned slaves, they were racist, they were this, they were that. And instead, what is the great mantra of our time? Progress! Let's go forward! Let's move forward! And everybody wants to move ahead, forge ahead. Move forward is the great mantra of the day. Progress, the great goal of our time. Because there is one problem. If you're standing at the edge of a really high cliff, the advice to go forward is not always appropriate. When somebody says, let's go forward, I'll lead you forward, you might first, before you just jump on the bandwagon, you might take stock of your surroundings. You might make clear just where you stand. But that's not what we did. Because, well, that was essentially what we were being told in 2008, wasn't it? Under the mantra of change, we're going to progress, we're going to move forward. One of those times when you ought to say, forward to what? Change to what? Because before you accept change, you need to know that it's not going to be changed for the worse, but changed for the better. How can you know this? It's not as if, though, there wasn't a time when, and a recent time, too, when our politicians were far more prone to respect the common sense that understands that you're not discussing whether we should change, you're discussing whether the changes that are being proposed are any good, or whether, in fact, they will lead us into evil. And this is the real question. Jimmy Carter understood that. He understood that when he was running for president of the United States. I have to be truth in advertising requires that I say that I'm a big fan of Jimmy Carter's necessarily, but he did have a slogan that I think tells us something about where we were at the time when he ran for office. And it's not that long ago. Where were we? We were at a point where a politician running for office took it as his slogan, why not the best? Anybody remember that? That was his slogan, why not the best? Now, yes, it may very well be that implied that Jimmy Carter had a really good opinion of himself. And that's not necessarily a recommendation for high office, humility being perhaps more appropriate to somebody you're going to entrust with power that might otherwise be abused by somebody who thought that he was the be-all and end-all. But I think, among other things, Jimmy Carter's profession of faith kind of inoculated people against the possibility that he'd end up thinking he was God. In any case, he had the slogan, why not the best? What did that mean, though? It meant that when he approached the American people, he approached them with the idea in mind that in addition to loving the country, they also had great respect for it. They also took great pride in it. They also looked at what had come before with a sense of achievement and realized we have to live in a way that is worthy of what we think our country to be, and what we thought our country to be was the best. And therefore, to lead the best, and to make sure that we were able to preserve the best, we would need to bring forward from our midst the best that we could find. But that is no longer the sense you get from our politicians. These days, I think they would be more honest if you reviewed the course of the last couple of decades. We went from why not the best to, well, why not the good, but, you know, he's not the best, but he's okay. Why not the not quite as good? And then you move over to, well, why not the, well, I know he's no darn good, but at least he's not so bad. And so we got the, why not, he's not so bad. And now he's not so bad has changed because we ended up in a place, and that's what evil will always do if you give it a chance. You start making it clear that you are going to make your judgment based on how extreme the evil is that you oppose. And what's evil going to do? It's going to seek out the most extreme possibility in a moment and stand there, so as to pull you deeper and deeper into the territory of evil. And so we go from he's not so bad to he's a little less evil than the evil the other guy is offering. And finally that standard of evil becomes so forgotten that you are faced with the fact that you have no choice between the worst evil and the worst evil. And then you finally wake up to the truth. That if you are going into the voting booth and have no choice of evil, you have left the kingdom of God. And you are living in the kingdom of hell. And it takes a while. It can fool us sometimes because we are still walking around amidst what looks like the superstructure of greatness and success and achievement. But more and more we are feeling, aren't we, the darkness gathering, the gloom gathering, the sense that what was once a testimony to our ongoing achievements has instead become the relic of our once great past. And so we are saying, how can we get back to where we belong? How can we restore? How can we renew? How can we proclaim? But here's the problem. How can you judge what is best, what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong? Except there is a standard for that. Can't know. Can't tell the difference between right and wrong unless there is a standard that allows you to distinguish between right and wrong. Perhaps that is the greatest achievement of the founders. Perhaps that is the answer that we ought to be giving to folks who are willing to look at their sins and yet forget that sinful though they may have been, as all of us are, we all fall short of the glory. But sinful as they may have been, what is it that they refused to do? What is it that they were willing to do? They were willing not to give up the standard of right and wrong, the standard of better and best, the standard of perfection. And even though by that standard they would be condemned, yet they rather threw themselves on the mercy of Almighty God than abandoned the truth that His perfection ought to reign over us. And you tell me what you prefer. Folks who, sinful though they are, never forget the true standard of good and right and perfect being. Or folks who decide as we have been deciding in this perverse and corrupt generation, that whatever is our whim, whatever is our preference, whatever is our choice, whatever is our passion, whatever is our pleasure, that shall be the standard of good as we worship not God, but ourselves and the idol we make of our own will. This was not the founding of our country. Because even though later in the document they talk about the unalienable rights, and then in the Declaration they say, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. For a long time I read that phrase, the consent of the governed, and just took it for granted that I understood what it meant. Of course I didn't know what it means. It means those who are governed by the government, right? Well, years ago in a discussion I was having with my friend, he raised the question, what is the government over the people who wrote that document? Because they rebelled against the British government, and there was, as of yet, no government established over the whole people of the United States. So when they refer to the consent of the governed, what were they talking about? What sense did that make? And the answer, however, is clear from the Declaration. Clear from the Declaration because they read the Declaration and wrote the Declaration, and when they read the word right, what did they hear? See, we say the word right these days, and what do we hear in our minds? How do we translate it, in fact, into meaning? Because of the habits of our leaders, studiously chosen habits, by the way, purposeful habits, corrupting habits, intended to corrupt. When we hear the word right, we immediately think of freedom. Freedom. I have the right to do something means I have the freedom to do it, and you and I both know they use the words interchangeably. Even in big momentous occasions like FDR and the Depression, what did he talk about? The goal that America was standing for and our people were fighting for, and so forth and so on. The four freedoms speech. Freedom, the be-all and end-all. You will hear it today. You will hear it from Rand Paul. You will hear it from others who say that we're all American. And what's America about? America's all about freedom. The goal of American government, freedom. The goal of American life, freedom. Oh, no. Turns out that doesn't seem to be the case, because in the beginning there, they didn't say that freedom was the first goal. In fact, insofar as freedom is referred to, what did they call it? They called it liberty. And they included it among the rights. They didn't say that you were having the goal of freedom. They basically said you are defined by God in terms of rights that cannot be taken away from you, without which you are not what you are. And one of those rights was liberty. But that means that liberty, to use the old phrase, is antecedent to, it comes before, it has a higher place than, it encompasses what is meant by freedom in this context. And therefore, freedom in this context must be defined in terms of right. But then the question arises again. You can't define right in terms of freedom, so you can't say that what they're talking about is freedom. So what's right defined in terms of? It's defined in terms of endowment by Almighty God. What does endowment mean? It means to fill something with its content, to give it its substance. And that means that the substance of right is determined by the will of Almighty God, the will of the Creator of our nature and our being. And that means that right is no longer and was not at the time understood as freedom simply. Rather, right was understood as, well, what the name implies. In a way, asking yourself the question, what is a right, is like asking who's buried in Grand Street. You've already said the answer when you ask the question. What is a right? It is what is right. Not what is free to do and be whatever, but what is already determined to be right and just and in accordance with the standard of that which is right and just. A standard determined, as Lincoln would later, in his own spare and pithy fashion, summarize perfectly when he said of the cause of America as it faced the end of the Civil War, that we would go forward to heal the nation's wounds and care for the widows and the orphans, to do right as God gives us to see the right. That was the understanding of right on which America was founded. The understanding of right that acknowledges that God is the source, God is the substance, God is the defining will and programmer of what is right and just. And what does that correspond to? Well, you go back and look at the founding, it's pretty clear. He created us. And when you create something, you make it what it is, and when you make it what it is, you have defined what it is, and therefore what is consistent with its preservation and continuation, right? This is the premise of the Declaration. That God, our Creator, in having the will to bring us into existence, has already defined for us what makes us what we are, what preserves us in our being as what we are. The will of God for us is therefore, from the get-go, a benevolent will. A will that wants us to be here, and that has predisposed the almighty substance of the whole entire universe that we are possible. because that is his will. And the founders then said, what? You based your form of government on the idea that government's purpose is to secure rights and that all the just powers of that government are therefore to be derived from the consent of the governed, which is to say, those who are governed by their respect for what God has determined to be right for them. Yes? Right in the context of a universe in which they are possible by the will of God. Right in the context and on the condition of a will predisposed for their well-being and happiness. That, by the way, is, as you and I both know, a Christian assumption about who God is and how he is disposed toward us, and how he disposes of the question of what is going to best serve our continued preservation, existence, and happiness. If that is, in fact, the meaning of the Declaration's truth, of the truths that it presents as the bedrock foundation of American life, how on earth can we expect that in turning away from God, we have not turned away from and abandoned and dissolved the very foundation of all that made the edifice of our liberty, which is not freedom, but freedom used according to right as defined by Almighty God. How can we expect that we shall preserve that edifice once the will of Almighty God is held in contempt, or even once they have decided that it is not of relevance at all? Not relevant at all. Not necessary. Don't have to worry about God. That reminds me, of course, of what I read recently about Stephen Hawking. I don't know if any of you saw it, but there was a little flurry of articles in the news. And I presume they were in the news because somebody found this shocking and surprising. Now I have to confess, I didn't. But Stephen Hawking, a great physicist, he was interviewed in a Spanish newspaper. Right? He had, in the course of his writings about this, he had actually written in a way that left some people in doubt about the question of whether or not he, Stephen Hawking, believed in God. And so the interviewer at one point raised this. He said, well, you know, there's a question that's been raised because in one of the works that you wrote, you said that when the scientists, human scientists have arrived at the theory of everything, they will then have explored or be able to explore the mind of God, right? To know the mind of God. Very bold claim. Now, I know he's a great physicist and all, and I presume that within the bounds of science, he's a man to be respected because he's managed to have some insights that the physicists found very impressive. I can't really judge about that because I'm not a physicist. But since they found it impressive within their purview, I'm willing to say, okay, he's a great physicist. But when he makes the judgment that he did, that God isn't necessary to explain the universe, is that a statement of scientific fact? Well, how can it be a statement of scientific fact when, in the first instance, he's making a statement about the origins of the universe? And science requires, right, that you be able to base your statements in the end, not just on a theory, but on data that then confirms on the basis of observed facts the theory that you have put down. And here we have Stephen Hawking saying that God's not necessary, and what was it on the basis of? It was on the basis of an assertion about human beings developing a theory of everything that hasn't even been developed yet and may not even be possible, right? And then saying that when we get to that theory of everything we don't have yet, then we will know the mind of God, and God isn't necessary to the creation. You do realize that the point I'm making is that even a child of a certain age would be able to come to the conclusion, that's not scientific. There's nothing scientific about that statement. A scientist has to be able to connect his theory with what is the observed result in data. But he doesn't do that. Now, of course, I understand why people are prone to accept it anyway. They're prone to accept it anyway because they've accepted other so-called scientific things that are on the same basis. The most prominent one being the one that I'm referring to when I ask a simple question. How many of you here have seen a dinosaur? Raise your hands. Have you seen a dinosaur? Oh, gosh, no. Has anyone in our time seen a dinosaur? No. Has anybody had an experiment in which they went out and followed the dinosaurs, observed the dinosaurs, were able to look at how dinosaurs that developed from the time that they are eggs or whatever they were born from? Has anybody done this? No. What have they actually done? They've actually gone out and having found some bones and put them together in a way that actually was not necessarily in many instances the way they found them in the ground. They had to do a little creative thinking to put the bones together in the first place, and then they look at the result and they say, this corresponds to this creature I'm drawing over here. That doesn't sound like science. That sounds like poetry to me. That sounds like fabrication. That sounds like a great work of the imagination to me. It doesn't smack of that rigorous observation, that rigorous reliance on what you can substantiate empirically. That is the bedrock foundation of the high authority, so far as it is deserved, of the science that has been producing wonders that have transformed our world. But the real scientists know that those wonders do not include anything that allows them to make a judgment about God, about his existence, about his authority, or even about simple questions like, well, what is the difference between right and wrong? Science can't address that question at all. It has no basis for doing so. Science can only observe things after the fact, but the question of right and wrong must be based on a premise that is applied to the facts before they occur. And if that premise isn't there, you have no standard on the basis of which to come to a judgment about whether what you're looking at is good or bad, good or evil, right or wrong. You just don't know and can't know because you have no standard for judgment. And so to the extent that Mr. Hawking decides that he's coming to a conclusion about whether God's necessary to the universe based on the theory of everything they haven't developed yet and couldn't in any case verify by observation, I think this is pretty questionable. And though he's an eminent scientist, I don't see any particular reason to regard his view of this as having any authority whatsoever. Certainly isn't derived from science. But then later on, when he's pressed on the point, he's asked about whether he has said that creation isn't necessary for the origin of the universe, so he's asked, well, how did the universe originate? And he says, well, I don't think it's God because he's not necessary. I believe in creation from nothing. Okay. Now, of course, when I wrote a little something about this, and because after I read it, what came to my mind was that statement by King Lear. When he asked Ophelia what she has to say, she says nothing. He says, nothing comes from nothing. That statement, nothing comes from nothing, seems to correspond to common sense. I'm not sure, however, that it's scientifically verifiable. Because if you go back far enough, like a child continuing to say, why, or where did that come from? They do that sometimes. You get to a point where you realize that we human beings have to take something for granted. And if you take anything for granted when explaining the origins of the universe, then you haven't explained the origins of the universe. Because there's always left the question, where did that come from? And unless you can somehow, in a scientific way, confirm the origin of what you're dealing with, you cannot make intelligible the cause of the universe. That's why though they make big claims for whatever theories they come up with, Big Bang Theory and so forth, doesn't explain the origin of everything, because they still haven't explained the origin of what blew up. And they will never be in a position to explain. Just as we will, in a certain sense, never be in a position to turn our observations on the faculty of observation that makes them possible. Sort of like a camera, where the cameraman continually slips behind the camera and therefore never appears in the observation that the camera makes possible. I say all of this because, not because wow, that decides the question. I don't know that it does, but it does raise enough of a problem that we are under no obligation whatsoever to surrender our faith on the authority of science, for science has no such authority. And therefore, when they come to us and say we must banish God, we must have separation of church and state, flying in the face of the doctrine and truth on which this nation was founded, we have a choice to make. We can embrace their science and let our nation perish, or we can lift up the authority of our God and return our nation to greatness. And this is the choice that is now faced by the American people. It's a choice, however, that our politicians seem very reluctant to make. And I don't know that the choice, they're reluctant to make it because they have some big qualms about God or anything. I don't think they particularly care. I frankly watch the way that a lot of them behave these days, and I think their greatest objection to Christianity isn't that it's false, it's that it's not useful. Because if you're a Christian and you actually think that there's a standard higher than force, a standard higher than money, a standard higher than any human power, essence, possibility whatsoever, that can make you an awfully ornery person. Because when they come and they tell you that you've got to do X, and you consult what God has said about that, and He says, no, X is wicked, X is an abomination, X is unacceptable, X is rejected by me from all time, you say, no, who am I to follow, as the apostle said? Who shall I obey, God or you? Well, I'm pretty clear on it, I'll go with God. Now what would-be tyrant, what demagogue looking for supreme power would want to have to rule over a people who is actually unwilling? The elites of our time, they enjoy power and perquisites and wealth and conveniences that were undreamt of by the most powerful people in the world. They are probably the most pampered, the most significantly privileged elite in the history of mankind. But there's one thing that they can't do, that the elites in the past were able to do, that Caesar was able to do, and so forth. When was the last time you visited the temple of Bill Gates? Or the temple even of any of them? No, because even when we visit the Lincoln Memorial, however we may feel respect and a certain kind of reverence for what he represented in terms of human virtue and stature, nobody confuses Abraham Lincoln with God. Right? Nobody confuses Bill Gates. He may or may not have more money than God. I don't know that God has any money. He has no use for it. But leave that aside. He may or may not. But we all know he ain't God. And if somebody tried to convince us he was God, we'd stand him down. Nope, it's not God. That's a privilege they don't have. They can't erect a temple to themselves. They can't require that as a business of government, we've got to worship at their altar. But they want it. And though we don't realize it yet, that's precisely what they're getting us to do. They are coming up with requirements and ideological thises and that's that now have us at a point. And the other day I was reading an article in which a lady actually said this. She said, abortion is sacred. Oh, gosh. Abortion is sacred. What does that mean? That this is somebody who is confusing what abortion involves with what worship involves. The worship of God, sacred. Right? But I don't think that's an excellent. Because I think that what abortion has been all along is a return to the idea that some human goal, some human whim, some human preference, some human convenience is worth the sacrifice of our children so that we can show respect for them. Right? That's child sacrifice. It always has been. That's one of the reasons I think that the Pope referred to abortion as a culture of death. Or to put it in more abbreviated terms, abortion is a death cult. And the high priests of that death cult are the politicians and public figures who preach the doctrine of abortion as somehow essential to being what we are supposed to be, which is to say, to human liberty and human choice. You understand? This is a transformation that goes beyond what some people think, because it touches the very heart of what we are. But we are forgetting the heart of what we are, because we are forgetting the meaning of rights, and we are accepting a false understanding that requires that we abandon the premise without which we don't have any rights, without which we cannot claim to govern ourselves, which is the premise of God's authority, the premise that in His superintendent benevolence and intelligence, God has made us in such a way that each of us stands equal in His sight. Here again we have the problem of science. I remember when Harriet Miers was nominated by Bush for the Supreme Court. Controversy came up because she was born again, and this, of course, inspired and made enthusiastic some Christian folks, and it was like a red flag, and made a lot of prophets and mouths and so forth. Now, I remember, though, reading an account of a speech that Harriet Miers gave before a group, I think, in Dallas, in which she had said that no issue should be dealt with in our politics that cannot be dealt with in scientific terms. Okay. And I thought immediately, I read that, I thought, well, I guess Harriet Miers isn't what they're telling me she is. Because, for one thing, we have this really important notion on which the country is founded that we're all created equal. Will somebody explain to me what scientific data there is for this? You do realize that that's a very hard premise to establish with respect to human beings. Scientists would put together an experiment, and they would have to carefully go through all the different human capacities and capabilities that there are. They would have to then take a representative sample, and they would have to see how people fared. What do you think they'd find? They would find that there is no ability or talent whatsoever in which human beings are actually equals. That, as far as science can tell, human beings are not equal in any respect that's relevant for politics, because the only respect in which they are equal, I suppose, is that at some point they're all going to die. But this does not seem to have an implication for equality in politics that's worth much. So, she is telling us that unless it can be dealt with by science, it can't be dealt with. So the premise of American life can't be dealt with in our politics. We must banish it from our consideration. But if, as a people whose right to govern themselves is founded on a logic that depends on that premise, do you think we're going to have our liberty for long once we have followed the Harriet Miers of the world and substituted the judgment of scientists for the judgment of God when it comes to human justice? But we are still faced with a challenge. Because if all that's true, Alan, and it frees us up to reject their rejection of that premise, it still leaves us with kind of a quandary. In what respect are we all equal? And I, thinking about this, and over the course of my life, one good illustration of the respect in which we are all equal happened to me when I was first in India. It was in the first few weeks that I was there. And I remember visiting the area where all the big tourist hotels are and so forth and so on. And while I was just then wandering around looking at things, because everything seemed strange to me in India. It's very, for an American, it's a very exotic place never to have been to before. Right? And one of the things you had to get used to was the fact that people were baking everywhere you went. People would come up and they'd bake and so forth, sometimes singly, sometimes in groups, often young kids. And a group of young kids came up to me and they were asking me for to give them something and so forth. And I had been there already long enough to decide that no matter who asked, I was going to follow Christ's injunction, because I thought to myself, it was made for this circumstance. Because you realize after a moment that if you're not careful, you will go on saying no, no, no until you're hard-hearted. Christ didn't tell us to give to all who asked because he wanted us to help others. He said it in the first instance because he wanted to make sure we didn't damage ourselves. That's my belief. You damage yourself when you say no to the charitable movement of your heart again and again and again. And eventually you become like many people. But I meant it. The prevalence of poverty and the prevalence of begging and so on meant that they had put up a wall against appreciating the real nature of the people who have, the real need and the real sympathy we are required by God to have for their condition. And so I decided, no, I wasn't going to let myself become all hardened. I was going to give a little something to everybody. So I was there distributing essentially a couple of rupees to each of these kids. Now, this wasn't, a rupee at the time wasn't worth more than a few cents, but leave that aside. You are doing this because it's the right thing to do. Well, what was the response? The response was to tug on me and say, well, why don't you stay with us for a while? We'll show you around. You know your way around here, we'll be your guide. So I spent the afternoon with this young group of beggars, going from place to place, following their routine, doing a little begging. They made the rounds of the big hotels, visiting the area where they threw stuff out. Because, of course, you have the banquet tables, and you have all the big dues, and an enormous amount of good food goes to waste, and the kids knew this, and they visited. And at one point in all of this, they found what was a treasure trove for kids. It was a cake that had been prepared for some function at the Taj Mahal Hotel. And there they were, dividing up, and everybody getting a piece of this cake. And they had been talking all amongst themselves and so forth. And the fellow who was basically acting as my translator, because he spoke more than a little English, he suddenly woke up and took a piece of the cake and turned around to me and said, "Here, have some cake." And it's in that moment that I got an impression, and it just came over me in a way that's never left. But there I was. Compared to these kids, I was rich, and privileged, and even a little powerful. And yet, for all that they were poor, and anybody would have said that they were powerless, and so forth, and saying that big magnificent status, yet this very thing, this very heart of sharing even though what you have might be so much less than nothing in the eyes of those to whom you give it. That sharing was just in his heart, and like nature itself, he was moved to bring me heaven. And that's when I understood something that I've never forgotten. That's when I realized. When it comes to the inclination to do right, as God gives us to see the right, it does not matter whether you are rich or poor, whether you are small or great, whether you are the mightiest intellect or the simplest thinker. You can still be moved by God's goodness written on your heart. You can still, in your conscience, strive to do what God has proclaimed as right. And even though you be powerless to achieve it, yet your heart can move, and your will can move in a way that perhaps moves the greatest mountain of all, which is the mountain of your own inclination to resist the power of God and substitute your will for His. That makes sense of equality, but that means insofar as we come together in right, the equality of all lies in their capacity to make that choice, to stand with others who are willing to do the same. And so whether you bring to that community of right power and wealth and intelligence and skill, or you bring to that community of right nothing but the heart to recognize and pray that it be done, yet you are the equal of every other who stands on that common ground. For what you are is not determined by what you look like in comparison to others. It is determined by how you stand in the substance of God's will. And He has left it open to all of us to make the choice for right. And in some ways, that's what qualifies people to go into the voting booth. All equally. trying to apply that little kernel of truth that God speaks in our conscience, to do the one thing that we shall be allowed to do, to affirm, to give worth to the choice that corresponds to our best understanding of his will. And that means that whether science validates it or not, the inner truth of our own existence, of our own ongoing relationship with the substance God offers to us, and which offering he confirmed when he sent his only begotten Son to make clear to us that in our form, in our flesh, yet we can choose him, and through him, the God whose will he represents. I think that's the truth on which America is founded. And when you say, "Oh, we want to take America back," the first question is the same you have to ask of the people promising progress and the people promising change. Now, take America back to where? Take America back to whom? And I think the answer is as simple as the question itself. The answer is as clear as the foundational truths on which we act when we go into the voting booth, and by which we are given the privilege of being part of a people who has an opportunity, each and every one of us, to give back to the community that portion of God's understanding, of God's will, of God's justice that he has woven into the fabric of our being. We can do that. And in doing so, what happens? What happens is what Christianity makes clear. Accept the goodness of God within you, which is to say, accept the truth that he has exemplified in the offer of his Son to come and become the indwelling principle of heart, mind, soul, and will. And guess what you are? You are one who, if they are willing to accept it, has the judgment of the greatest priest, the judgment of the greatest prophet, the judgment of the greatest king. For he indwells within you, his heart, your heart, his will, your will, his mind, your mind. And if you will but accept the generous gift of God, then that generosity will offer all that wisdom, all that power, all that greatness which belongs to God, to the good of the country. Don't you think that more than explains the true miracle that has been in the past the success of America? That the founders acknowledged in their impossible war against Great Britain, that the abolitionists acknowledged in their impossible war for justice for the slaves. That people have acknowledged in every crusade for justice, every crusade for right, for women, for children, whatever it might be, for workers. They have been moved by the thought that though I stand alone, if I stand in the justice of God, the fact that I am alone does not mean that I am powerless, and it certainly does not mean that I am wrong. And so we saw the building up of this great country until we decided to turn our back on that fundamental truth which lies in our relationship as a people in the very heart of our identity with the God who not only makes us free, but makes our freedom right. See that? So I think it's pretty clear. What I have to say is very simple. We sure do need to take America back, but we're not taking it back from anybody, but rather we are going to the place where we can give it back to God. And in taking it back to God to make that again, we will place it again in the place illuminated by his will and by his justice, by his determined hope expressed for mankind in the moment of our creation, that we should be as he is, made in his image and likeness, to bask in the glory of his being, now, if we choose, and forever, if we say take back America, let's take America back to that hope.